Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I want to talk to you about some great options in terms of apps that you can use for patients that you see in clinic. We're going to look at a range of options here, including what I use for running gait analysis, things you can use for building agility, assessing strength, range of movement and power. So quite a few good options for you to look at. I should also point out right from the start that these are just the apps that I would use in clinic with patients. We don't have any financial relationship with any of these apps whatsoever. These are purely things that I use in clinic and I find useful. Now, I am mainly an Apple user, so most of these will be most useful for Apple users, but wherever possible, I'll talk about, other options you can consider if you're not using Apple devices. Also, before we dive in, I do want to say have a think about data protection in clinic for your patients. Some of these apps will collect patient data, maybe even videos of the patient. So we need to make sure we've got their permission and that works well with the policies wherever you're working. So do think about those. And we've also got some interesting personal news, exciting personal news. We have a new team member at Running Physio. We have Loki. Cocker Spaniel, who's joined us as head of bone health. He is a tiny little puppy, 8 weeks old, so I'm slightly sleep deprived at the moment. So if I make the odd mistake, do forgive me. But lots of fun to have around, definitely making things interesting here. So let's talk about some of these apps, and we're going to go through 10 that I would use in clinic. If you've got other app ideas, please do let me know. I've also put a link to our selection of free videos that we've got available for you at the moment, including great videos on tendinopathy, lower back pain in athletes, and lateral hip pain, so do check those out. So first on the list that I want to get to is what app do I use for running gait analysis? I do get asked this a lot, so this was a big motivator for me to want to record this and actually give you some information about it. Now, it used to be that we could use an app called Huddle. This was a really fantastic app for recording running gait, but unfortunately it was discontinued. Its replacement is called OnForm. Now, OnForm is the app that I would tend to use now for running gait analysis. It allows you to take videos and import videos. It has a feature in it that you can see on the screen here where it will try and highlight rough kind of lines of movement. You can draw your own lines and things in there. You can go through frame by frame. You can also do before and after. So that's what I've done here. So we've got a before on the left and an after on the right to allow us to see what effects our running gait cues have had. Or you can use the same feature for putting your different views next to each other. If you want a rear view and a side view next to each other, for example. And you can then share your videos with your runners, their coach potentially, and it really allows you to go through nicely with your gait analysis. And this works really quite well. You can get people to send you videos, perhaps if you're seeing patients online, and import them into that software to have a look in slow motion at their running gait. So this is the main software I would tend to use for this. It works really nicely with your phone if you've got a phone with a high frame rate, or if you've got a tablet with a high frame rate, because you can take a video and then analyze it there within the app, and you can see most of the things that you'd want to see and assess within your gait analysis. Now, there are other options out there, but sadly, this seems to be an area where several of these apps are being discontinued. The Huddle Technique app, for example, has been discontinued. So we used to have lots of options here, Coach's Eye, Dartfish, for example, but they do seem to be going away. So this seems to be one of the main ones I would use at the moment for this, particularly useful if you use an Apple product, an iPhone or an Apple tablet. So that's OnForm. If you were with Huddle previously, you can import your videos from them, which is quite a handy feature. I've got several thousand videos through the years, so it's been quite useful to be able to bring them in. So that's the first one to consider. Next up, staying on the idea of running gait, is MetroTimer. Now, MetroTimer you'll see on the left of the screen here. This is really, really simple. It is just a metronome app. So you can set the beat of the metronome, and then you can get someone to run to the beat to use that as a way of increasing someone's step rate. So really, really handy, very, very simple, just produces a nice beep that people can run along to. You might notice as well, there's this tap button on there as well. You can tap along to someone's running to approximate their step rate as well. So it's a way of potentially working out step rate and manipulating step rate. But in practice, you do need to tap along for quite some time for that to be accurate. I would usually go 30, maybe 60 seconds if you're going to choose that method. Personally, I just prefer to count the footfalls of 1 foot and multiply it by 2. So MetroTimer, again, there are other metronome apps out there. Do check out other options, but this has been a bit of a stalwart for me. I've used it successfully for many years. On the right hand side of the screen, we've got app 3 of our 10 that we're talking about today. This is Run Cadence by Christopher Johnson and Benjamin Wobker. Now this is a really clever app, I think. So there's 2 options which you can see on the screen here. First is you can get someone to run to test their cadence, so work out what their step rate is. And secondly, then you can get them to go for a run with a metronome set up to kick in if their cadence falls below a target number. So let's say, for example, you've got a runner whose starting step rate is 160, which is fairly typical, and you want to increase it by, say, 5%. That would take it up to 168. So you could set it up so that the metronome will only kick in if their step rate drops below 168. So it's quite a clever way of giving people some feedback that adjusts based on their actual step rate. Quite useful if you've got someone practicing some step rate increase initially, and perhaps you just want a little bit of feedback kicking in whilst they're running to keep them on track. So hopefully you can see this can work quite well with OnForm or other gait analysis apps you've used, because you can do your video, use your metronome, and see if it actually changes the running gait when you compare it. So few options there in terms of gait. Next up on my list of apps that I find particularly useful, we're going to think more about load management. So I quite like apps like Strava or TrainersOne, potentially things like Training Peaks or Garmin Connect. Now these are useful because we know, particularly in running injury, tracking someone's training and looking at their load is especially important. Now many of you will know Strava. It can track your runs really nicely. You can also follow your runners, obviously with their permission, and see what training they're up to as they're returning to running. So that's really quite helpful. Things like TrainersOne go a little bit deeper. So this is my data from TrainersOne. It looks at a number of different things. So if you've got a runner who really likes their data and they want to look at things like acute training load, also known as freshness in this app, or chronic training load known as fitness, or looking at their training stress balance, you can get that data from TrainersOne. So that links, I believe, with your Strava potentially. So these are quite good load management apps. Important though that you actually upload the data. So you can see a big gap in my data, and that's where for a good 2 or 3 months I forgot to upload anything. So important that we're consistent with uploading those runs in order for these apps to track them and see what they're up to. So these can be quite good to give us some idea of someone's training and how it's changing. And if someone's running and not really monitoring their training at all, they're not going to spot those big fluctuations that we know sometimes can lead to injury. So those are useful. Also, we've got to think not everyone I see in clinic, I'm sure it's the same for you, not everyone you see in clinic will be a runner. A lot of patients I work with actually might be looking at coming back into a lower level activity sometimes, like walking. And again, it can be useful to be able to find a way to monitor this. And that's where apps like the iPhone Health app come in. A lot of patients don't actually realise they walk around clutching their iPhone all day. They don't realise it counts the amount of steps that they take. So we can have a look at what their average steps per day has been over the last week. We can look at fluctuations in those steps per day, and we can look to see if that's actually got any relationship to their pain. And we do certainly see that sometimes. We see a big peak in steps per day, someone's been especially active, and then they have a flare in their pain that day or the day after. So these can be ways of then establishing what's average for this person, what's manageable, and what's excessive. It can also help them to make sense of flare-ups when actually they may be thinking they haven't done much more, and then they see they've actually done, in some cases, sort of 15, 20,000 steps per day, which they weren't aware of. So another really useful app to work with patients. There's lots of other pedometer style apps out there that you can get people to use to monitor their day-to-day activity. So we've got a few options so far. I think we've got to, that's app number 5. Next up, we're going to look at an app to measure range of movement. Now, this is the inclinometer app, which is part of Measure on the iPhone. Again, there are lots of inclinometer options out there available on Android and other devices. So have a look, see what works well with you. Now, I tend to use it for measuring ankle dorsiflexion, which you can see in the image on the screen here. So we get the patient's phone nice and snug to their tibia. We get them to come forward into dorsiflexion and we measure their range. And this approach was actually used by Barton et al. They used an inclinometer, not necessarily one from a phone, but they used one in their 2010 study as a way of measuring ankle range of movement. So this is really quite useful, much quicker and I believe much more accurate than things like your knee to wall testing if you want to have a look at range of movement. And you can experiment, of course, and look at testing range for various other joints and things too, if you prefer. Okay, so that's number 6. Number 7. Losing track. I did tell you I was sleep deprived. Number 7 is actually a collection of apps known as My Jump Lab, which is from Carlos Balsalobra. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly there, Carlos. I was stunned to discover that Carlos has created all of these apps, and he's also looked at researching them to validate many of them too, which is really excellent. So, we want to know these apps are measuring what we want them to measure. So there's a list here within this My Jump app. My Jump Lab here, all sorts of different options you can see. You've got options for measuring range, like we've done with the inclinometer app. We've got motion capture apps as well. We've got apps you can use for looking at running and sprinting. You've got all sorts of different things. A wellness questionnaire in there, but the one I use most from this selection is My Jump 2. Now, My Jump 2, we've got some information about that on the right-hand side of the screen here. You can measure things like vertical jump and horizontal jump. You can look at asymmetry and force velocity profiles. And it basically involves with the jumping, you take a video of someone jumping, you look at when they take off and when they land, and from there you can calculate really useful data around jump height and all sorts of different things. You can do with external load. There's lots of clever calculations in there. So this is a really quite nice app if you want to have some ways of measuring power and looking at things like jumping and plyometric ability. So it's a good one to have in there. Quite a few different options there for you to check out. Down to the last 2. So I believe we're on to the last 3. I tell a lie. The calf raise app. Now this is quite a good one for measuring calf function. And this is from Kim Herbert-Lossier, who's done a lot of really good research in calf raise testing. Now, this app is very, very clever. You draw a little marker just below the lateral malleolus, and then the app tracks that during a calf raise. So you can measure calf raise total and peak heel height, power and work, plus fatigue index as well. So this is a really quite sophisticated app for measuring calf function that you can use with your patients. So this allows you to go beyond just simply counting the number of calf raises, but testing things out a little bit more in the calf. Last image we have of these apps, this is Clock Yourself. Now this is by Meg Lowry, and this is a really great app for building agility and also multi-directional movement. It's a really simple premise, but it's used in a really clever way. So you'll see on the right hand side of the screen here that the phone presents you with a clock face, and the patient is stood in the middle of the clock face. And then when you start, it calls out a number. And on the simple levels, it might just be the number 2, and then the person might lunge across to put their foot on number 2, as you can see on the image on the bottom left. But the app gives you options to make this more complicated. So you can bring in upper body movements, you can bring in low-level plyometrics, you can bring in all sorts of movement combinations. You can increase the speed or change the direction. This is a really nice way then of building agility, and it's unpredictable change of direction, which is really useful when we're wanting to get people back into sport that's going to challenge them, particularly with unpredictable change of direction work. So we've gone through 9 different app options here, hopefully giving you lots of things that you can consider in clinic. One more I would like to add, particularly if you're trying to help someone who's struggling with their mental well-being, as we know is really common in our patients, and that would be to look at something like Andrew Johnson's apps. He's got a collection of apps with various different relaxation techniques, or something like the Headspace app that's available. There's lots of these out there, and I would encourage you to give patients 2 or 3 options if they're struggling, to look at ways that they can develop relaxation options, meditation, things like that can help calm their mind if they're struggling with their mental well-being. So this is a nice thing for them to consider. And I do daily relaxations. I find it really helps me, allows me to focus on what I want to do in the day. So it's a good way of kind of calming the mind down. Okay, so we've whizzed through 10 app options. Coming back quickly through the list, we had OnForm for gait analysis. We had MetroTimer and Run Cadence, both great ways of increasing step rate. We talked about Strava and TrainersOne as options for assessing training load in runners, and the health app or pedometer apps for looking at daily step count. Then we talked about using an inclinometer app for measuring range of movement, particularly useful for dorsiflexion. And then the My Jump Lab for a load of different options in there that you can use in clinic, particularly the My Jump 2 app, which allows you to look at jump height and power. Then we had the Calf Raise app for testing calf function, Clock Yourself, which is great for building agility. And finally, we talked about Andrew Johnson's app selections, and also the Headspace app for mental well-being. So lots of different options available for you to have a look at. If you've got some apps that you love using, that you find really useful, do let us know in the comments and replies. As I said from the start, do think about patients' data with this. Make sure we get consent, make sure it works with the policy of where you work. And as we said, we don't have any financial relationships with any of these apps. This is literally just a list of apps that I use with patients in clinic. So I hope you found it useful. Don't forget to check out our free videos that I've linked to as well. And I'm going to go and make sure Loki, our little puppy, is doing well. Okay, nice to speak to you again. Bye for now.